Hello everyone and welcome. This is very easily one of my most requested videos to make, a full-on Kerbal moon landing video. Everybody wants to get onto this right off of the bat. I do have a powered landing on Minmus video, and I still do maintain if you're doing your first powered landing, Minmus is definitely the easier of the two targets for you to head off to. I mean, I do understand why people want to head off to the moon instead. I mean, you just see it there, it's hanging there, it's taunting you, saying, come to me, come to me. And of course, there's the historical precedence as well of the Apollo missions that people like to try and emulate in a more KSP kind of style. This is going to be a two-parter. The second video will concentrate on the mission itself, while this first video here is going to be about design. But to make up for the fact that it's a two-parter, I'm not going to present you with just one, not two, but actually three different designs for how to accomplish this mission. And as always, the craft files are going to be down there in the description for you to download, play with, modify, do whatever it is that you want to do with them. Now, one thing I should mention is to remind people that this is a career mode game that I'm doing these tutorials from, and if we take a look here in the R&D center, I'm about midway through the tech tree, so you might have better tech available than I do with these, but the design elements are still going to be remaining the same. As always, our first step is going to be setting up a budget, so we pull out our Delta V map. And we're going to start off assuming we are already in low Kerbin orbit and start, remember how this works? You follow the path to your target and just add up the numbers along the way. So first off, it's an 860 meter per second burn to do our Munar ejection. Then we need to get a capture into low Munar orbit. That's 280 meters per second. From there, we're going to need to do the landing. Now, by the Delta V map, it's 580 meters per second. But really, if you could do the perfect descent, that's a good thing to budget. I myself, when I do this, I add on 25%. For this tutorial, I'm going to add 50% to this number. So we're going to budget 870 meters per second for our landing. We are now on the lunar surface. It's time to head home. Remember how this works? You just simply read the numbers backwards. So to get back to low Munar orbit, it is 580 meters per second. This number is actually a very good number for the ascent part. Ascents are always easier than descents. And then we need to get ourselves heading back towards Kerbin. That's the opposite of our capture burn. So that's another 280 meters per second. Remember, we can ignore this 860 meters per second because we're not going to be capturing into a low Kerbin orbit. Instead, what we're going to be doing is, of course, using the atmosphere to slow our craft down and then using parachutes to descend our Kerbals safely to the surface. So let's get into those designs, and our first design is going to be, I think what many people like to do, is to model it after the historical Apollo mission. That is having two separate vehicles, a lander, but also a command module, which is responsible for getting our Kerbals from Kerbin to the moon and back again safely. So I'm going to call this one the Kerpollo 11A. Don't forget there are two more coming after that. Now, when doing the design, always helps to start to think backwards. So we're going to start with the lander. So let's think about what the lander needs to do. Well, the lander is going to be dropped off in low Munar orbit and needs to do the landing. As mentioned, that's 870 meters per second. And then it needs to ascend back into Munar orbit. That's 580 meters per second for a total budget for the lander of 1,450 meters per second. And with that budget in mind, I built myself this little lander here with its 1,596 meters per second of Delta V. Should be able to comfortably get from low Munar orbit down to the surface and then back up again with fuel to spare. I've kitted it out with all the science I have to date, which quite frankly really isn't a lot, and also with some of the very new 1.11 science. So inside here, if I get into the inventory, I have here the EVA science kit as well as a repair kit in case you manage to break something. One thing now that I'm mentioning about 1.11 to be conscious of now is that when you're in the VAB, this delta V calculation takes into account whether you have Kerbals in there or not. So for instance, when this thing goes up, it's not going to have any Kerbals in it. But if you want this delta V to be right, make sure you do put Kerbals in there. So for instance, if I take him out, notice now my delta V goes up to 1,676, but that's not quite right because it's not going to go down to the moon's surface without any people in it. So put your Kerbals back in there. Now it's back here. Also be very careful to send the gear down you intend to go down with. I want them to have EVA packs, but there's no reason for them to have a parachute. They have a tendency to sneak parachutes back in on you, and that now counts for mass, so do make sure that you have this thing in the state you want it to be used in, including Kerbals, including what gear you want, or else this delta V number won't be reflective of what it is that you actually got. Also, while I'm looking down at this little tab, thrust to weight ratio. I personally like to get a thrust to weight ratio when doing powered landings on the moon of over 1, and this is set for Kerbin. You can change this to be what's your thrust to weight ratio in relation to the moon. This of course is now using the weight of this thing as it would be on the moon and the moon's gravitational field on the surface. But I don't really like this number because it really doesn't give me a sense of how much thrust this thing really has. I'm used to gravity on the Earth, which is the same as the gravity on the Kerbin. The thrust to weight ratio actually gives you the number of G's, which gives you the acceleration. 1.27 times 9.8 meters per second squared now gives you the acceleration of this thing. When I switch it to other bodies, other gravitational fields, I really have trouble wrapping my head around what that number really means. For some people, they might be perfectly fine with that. With me, I like to be consistent, always keep the body on Kerbin, so the numbers are, I'm always comparing apples to apples. Now, some people might be saying, well, wait a minute, if I'm on the moon, and this says 7.66, I mean, that's a ton of, doesn't that just have to be a little bit over 1? And the answer to that question is, yeah, you're right, it does. Technically, as long as this thrust to weight ratio is just over 1, you should technically be able to land, but personally I find it much more challenging to land when my thrust to weight ratio is very, very low, because I have, you're in orbit and you're going to be traveling at orbital velocities, and you need to get yourself down to the surface where you're going to have a velocity of 0 relative to the surface. If you have a very low acceleration, a very low thrust to weight ratio on your vessel, it becomes more challenging and you might see yourself plummeting towards the surface without the ability to slow yourself down fast enough. Having the extra thrust really does help with landing. So personally, if I'm landing on the moon, I want a thrust to weight ratio of over 1 on Kerbin's gravitational field. Your results may vary, but that's the way I built this thing. Still with 1.11, I also took the opportunity to kit it out with various lights. We have, you can't really see them when I put them on, but I have these lights to light this. I have navigation lights on there. These things I've noticed is when you re-render the vessel, they don't stay the color that you originally set them at. So if you're going to use the version of this vessel that I have in the craft file that's down there in the description, keep in mind that all the lights will probably go back to white. So if you want them to be, let me think about this. This is the right side here. I had this one green, this one red, and I had an amber light tucked in here somewhere. This guy here was amber flashing. That's up to you. The other thing I did too is I put in landing lights. These are the more powerful illuminators. I did try it with these spotlights down here on the bottom, but they're not that bright compared to the illuminators. Having landing lights is really useful, even if you're landing in the daytime, because it really gives you a sense of how close you are to the surface, especially when you're not spotting your shadow. And what I did is I toggled those landing lights. If we go to action groups, the illuminators down here are toggled in the gear action group. So that means that when I lower my landing gear, these lights come on, and when I raise my landing gear, the lights go off. I like that because that's what I'm going to be using the lights for, is for landing. But of course, this thing, if it's going to land, needs to first get into low Kerbin orbit, so that's what we got this for. So this is my command module, and its job is to take our 3 Kerbals for the crew. Again, make sure, let's check, let's see what's going on with the crew with this one. We got Valentine and Bill and Bob, and they only have jetpacks. To be honest, if you're really, really brave, what you could do is actually only give them one. I ended up in my mission only using 1 jetpack that Bob had, because he's the scientist, and that's the only reason in Kerbal Space Program you really need to use the EVA jetpacks. But I'm not brave enough for that, so let's get back here. If you go down to the cargo section, I think, yes, there are their jetpacks, so give them their jetpacks back. There we go. We also have, by the way, as well, you can give them extra EVA propellant. I think that's a pretty neat feature. I didn't add it in with my Kerbals, but you know, your results may vary. You will also maybe, like, you know, put up work lamps that you can place around your landing site. That's obviously completely up to you. But this thing's job is clearly to take the lunar lander from low Kerbin orbit to low moon orbit. Now, one thing when you go to do this style of a moon mission is you got to be really careful with the delta V. I mean, technically, if you add this up, this thing should have just the ability to get itself there, which is about 1140 meters per second, plus the 2A to get back home, which is going to be 1420 meters per second. And if you take a look down here, it's 2,150, but that's because this isn't taking into account the mass of the lander. So of course, when it travels, it's going to be in this configuration, and you can see here what I got is 1,475 meters per second, which might feel a little tight, but don't forget, when it's coming back, it won't have this lander along with it. And also in this configuration, I made sure that the EVA packs were in here, but if I go up here, there are no EVA packs and no Kerbals in this part, because this is the configuration in which it's going to be making the journey from low Kerbin orbit to the moon's orbit. But of course, this isn't the way it's going to launch, so when you go to launch this thing, you'll have to put it together in a form of booster so that they are all stacked together. And again, this booster is in the craft file that you have down there in the description if you want to take it and you want to play around with it, and you can take it and modify it and change it to whatever way you like to have it. There are no principles in the design of this booster that you haven't seen in previous videos already, so I'm not going to go over that part of it. And of course, once you have this kind of configuration, that means, you know, this mission becomes a little bit more complicated. You've got to do a little bit of a reorientation, dock these two together, pull the land module out, head off to the moon, of course undock again, that thing lands down, only with 2 Kerbals in it, 1 Kerbal's going to have to stay behind, then you have to get back into rendezvousing in lunar orbit after you've done your landing and docking, and that of course, you know, adds extra elements that you may find fun and adds to the experience, or you may find this is all entirely too frustrating for you. So this is a more complicated way in which you design your mission, but it's not the way everybody likes to do it. So I'm going to give you 2 more alternate ways. All of these, by the way, are in the craft file. So the Kerpollo 11B is this fella right here. This does the complete job all for you. If we take a look down here at the delta V, it's got 2,912 meters per second, comfortably over the 2,870 meters per second that's budgeted for this entire mission. If you can get this thing into low Kerbin orbit, from there on it can do everything. Get itself to the moon, insert itself into its orbit, do the landing, get back up into lunar orbit, and then return back to Kerbin and detach and bring your Kerbals safely down to the surface. What are the disadvantages of doing it this way? Well, one of those disadvantages would be the fact that this thing is actually a bit more massive than the situation we had before. If we go down here to our tab, this thing is 21.9 tons. Yet the Kerpollo 11A mission is 18.6 tons. So we're adding a few more tons of mass doing it this way. That's because, of course, you are carrying the entire vehicle with you for pretty much the entire mission, instead of, especially that part where you're going down to the surface. The entire vehicle has to go down to the surface of the moon and then come back up. So hence you need more fuel, bigger engines to get the job done. The other disadvantage of this thing is that it's rather tall, and people that have played a bit of KSP have had the wonderful experience of having their landers fall over, and a lander like this is more likely to fall over on you, so you've got to be more careful with it, especially if you land on a slopey surface. To kind of help combat that, I did put in an extra set of reaction wheels. Some people also like to add in RCS. I didn't do that, but you might want to do that. That is completely up to you. Again, this is just a basic design. And once again, of course, you have to put this guy on the booster. And actually, I put this onto the exact same booster I had before. Yeah, I overbuilt my booster so that the booster could handle all three of these Kerpollo 11 that you are coming up with. Yeah, I got lazy. But again, the craft file for this entire vehicle is down there in the description if you want to take it and play with it. This thing also has the advantage of being just frankly much simpler to design and build than the Kerpollo 11A that you saw earlier. But there is a third option. Let's get back to our budget and take a look at just the last part of this budget. The last thing that this thing, if we can imagine this thing being on the surface, it needs 580 meters per second to get back into low Munar orbit, and then another 280 meters per second to get back home to Kerbin. So that's a total of 860 meters per second. Let's imagine we're already on the surface and build something that just needs to get back to Kerbin. And actually, that's really easy to do. We're going to take the landing legs off. We're going to take off these bottom fuel cans like this. We're going to put the landing legs back on again, like that. And then we're going to change the engine up because this has lost a lot of mass. We're going to just put on a boring old Terrier. And you can see now that we have 1,837 meters per second, which is much more than we need. So we can actually start taking out more fuel. We can start reducing this. And what I eventually ended up with is this design. And this really didn't take too much work to get from the Apollo 11B to the Apollo 11C. You can see here it has 1,112 meters per second, a little bit more than the 860 meters per second that's required. And then all I had to do was build a simple stage that I could plunk underneath it, like that, to give me the total 2,910 meters per second that comfortably will get this thing from low Kerbin orbit to the moon and then back to Kerbin again. And by having this one being a little over 1,000 meters per second, what that means is that this stage should run out of fuel during my descent. So during my descent down to the moon, this thing will run out of fuel, we ditch it, and all we land is this part. It's kind of like the best of both worlds, combining the 11A that I showed earlier, that's sort of that Apollo style of mission, with the all-in-one thing that we were just looking at. This lander is shorter, it's lighter, and if you put the whole thing together, its total mass is only 19.5 tons, a little bit higher than the Apollo style we saw earlier, but quite a bit less than the previous one that we were just looking at that had everything together. So, 3 different Kerpollos. Let's actually see this one in action. And as you can see, I'm once again using the exact same booster. The same boosters launching all 3 versions of these Kerpollo missions. And once again, all 3 of these are down there in the description. Feel free to download them, play with them, modify them. I've only shown 3 different ways to perform this mission. There are many ways, but hopefully this has tweaked your imagination and given you ideas on how you want to do this yourself. And I also want to take this opportunity to welcome aboard my newest patron, Joseph Gerard Schwartz. Thank you very much, Joseph. It is the support of you and all of my patrons that ensure that new videos continue to come out on a regular basis. As for what's going on right now, although this is a much bigger rocket than what you've seen before in this series, this actual mission is exactly something you've seen before in a previous video. But I'll take the time right now just to kind of go over the main points. The first step here is to get yourself into an equatorial low Kerbin orbit. I prefer an altitude of around 80 degrees, though it could vary. Next, we set the moon as a target, and then we set up our maneuver to intersect with the moon. We adjust that maneuver so that our periapsis with the moon, I like around 12 kilometers. Some people like a little lower, some a little bit higher. Important bit is to be going around in a prograde direction. That means that you're on the trailing side of the moon as the moon is going around in its orbit about Kerbin. If you come around on the other side, your descent to the moon's surface is going to be more expensive. And of course, we're going to perform this burn. And once we're in the moon sphere of influence, we set up our capture burn. Of course, all the way along this process, we're collecting whatever science we can get along the way. And now that we're in this nice low orbit about the moon, the next step is going to be our descent. And that's going to be for our next episode. Yes, as mentioned at the very beginning of this is going to be a two-parter. Part 2 is going to be doing the landing, how to do your ascent back into low lunar orbit, and how to facilitate your safe return back to Kerbin. I hope you found this video useful, and I hope to see you again for the next one.